Good morning, everyone. Is that on? Okay. It's hard to tell if that's just me being loud or if it's actually on. Can't really tell sometimes. Good to see everybody. Thank you for joining us if you are at home or remote. We appreciate you being part of our class and our service. We're continuing on with our study of Satan's tactics. And we're still somewhat kind of introductory today. Next week, we start looking at some of the ways in which Satan comes after us in more detail. And remember, there are at least 3 classes who are studying this at the same time. More or less the 6th through the 12th grade is studying it. The Flock class is studying it. We are. And so there's a great deal of focus within our family here at Center Chapel on how Satan comes after us. And it's really something I wish I had known, had studied, had talked about when I had been younger, but I think it's very much a timely thing to look at no matter what age we may be, because Satan never puts us in retirement and gives up on us. So let's take a look here this morning. The title this morning is The Identity of a Spiritual Warrior. That's the topic. Last week we talked about how we were in spiritual warfare, that unlike physical battles, we're in a battle, a war that's going on that you can't necessarily see from the outside. But it's very, very real. The fact that it's spiritual warfare, the fact that it's a somewhat hidden, non-visible war, unlike some of the ones that are going on in the world, does not mean it's not real. Well, we are participants in that warfare. Every human being alive is, because we're either, as the Bible would say, a slave to sin, right, or we're a slave of God. We're on one side or the other, even if you don't necessarily realize it if you're a slave to sin. There are a lot of people who perhaps aren't aware of God or don't care or don't think about God, and so to them, whatever, I'm just getting up and going about my life today, but they're in the battle as well. So when we think about this, think about soldiers in the physical realm. My son-in-law, a Marine, he had to go through training to be ready, right? You don't just, hey, you're in the war today, unless you're in a really bad way. You don't just pick somebody up, hand them a weapon, and have them suddenly on the front. There's training that people go through in order to get ready. And I believe there's a number of lessons to learn in a physical army, battle, soldier kind of situation that can apply to us in our spiritual warrior situation. For example, there are customs and traditions that armed services will have. If you think about it, right, when the general walks in, what do the troops tend to do, right? What's the person say? 10 hut, or which is always humorous to me. It's just that shortcut of saying attention, 10 hut. Sounds like a football play more than anything. But you have customs and traditions. Well, there are customs and traditions in the spiritual warfare. One of the things that we do as a custom is we get together and we have a class. A class in and of itself is not specifically called out in the New Testament. The Christians got together on the first day of the week and they worshiped together, they sang, they read. But a separate particular class is somewhat a tradition we have. We have a tradition on Wednesday night. We have a tradition on Sunday night. Those are traditions that the elders here are offering to those who are members of the congregation, members of the family of God that meets here, that another gathering, another congregation may not have the exact same traditions, but the tradition is to study, to learn, and as we said in Boy Scouts, to be prepared. To be prepared. There's also sometimes dress and grooming standards. Think back to Gomer Pyle, if we're old enough to have remembered watching that. Boy, they sure had, Sergeant Carter had a great haircut, didn't he? Probably could have sliced paper with it by just running it over the top of his head. They're all supposed to look the same. You are in a uniform because you are to appear uniform. You are to appear the same. Part of that is to make sure you lose some of that sense of individuality and you are thinking of we. Part of it is in order to instill discipline. If you're not necessarily following rules, which can be somewhat arbitrary. You still are not necessarily all moving in the same direction, the same lockstep, the same goal. And so a big part of that, as I said, is to lose that sense of self and take on the sense of us. Well, that's something we desperately need each and every day, because as we'll see, one of the big ways that Satan comes after us is an appeal to self. And so we need to always be thinking that we are a family and we are all collectively attempting to go home to live with God. We need to look out for each other. We need to realize that we are collectively in a battle against Satan. We are in a battle against sin. And so I think that's very appropriate to have the New Year's resolution that we're focusing on this year of bearing one another's burdens. You know, you probably have seen war movies or whatever, and you've got, there we go, now we're up there. Jason's got me turned up now. I'll step back. You've got somebody, a troop or a platoon that are out there, and one of them gets injured or one of them is about to fail or just can't do it. What do the other members of the troop do? They come to the aid of the person that's having trouble. Maybe they carry the backpack. Maybe they get under one's shoulder to help the individual go. That is, in an army, in a military perspective, helping to bear the burdens of one of your team. Why? Because there is no I or me, there is us. There is us. And I'm hoping that will come more to the forefront as we really try to focus on that this year here at Center Chapel. You also have to, as I say, to learn how to work with others. You know, that's supposed to be something we all learned in kindergarten. You know, I mean, you don't run up and just grab all the juice off the tray when the teacher brings it out. You got to learn to play nice with other people and work with others. It takes specialization, but it takes teamwork. Teamwork. And what's the old saying, right? There is no I in team. But as I told my son when he was working with a group in med school, they would get study groups together. I said, there's no I in team, but if working together to help study, you may find that there is an A in team in terms of getting good marks. Well, certainly in a team, there is success. There is success. The last thing I think any of us would want to do is to take on Satan individually. He'd come after us individually, but that's rather foolish, right? I'm going to walk out into the jungle or into the Serengeti or someplace, and I'll take on any lions or tigers or whatever that may come up. Much safer to be in a group of people and much safer to be prepared than thinking we can do it on our own. You also need to know how to use the equipment and weapons. There's a lot of time and effort, if you think about training an army, that's looking at the guns and the equipment. And everybody really kind of needs to know how to use the same thing. There's certainly a lot of stuff in common. Why do they want them to, be able to take apart the rifle and put it back together so quickly? Because you may have to do that when you're under fire, and you may need to do that for somebody else's weapon too. So you need to know how to use equipment and weapons. Well, what we'll see from a spiritual standpoint, Paul is very clear about put on the whole armor of God. And so we need to know how to use the weapons and the tools and the equipment that God has given us in order to not only fight the fight to help convert the world, but also to protect us against those fiery darts that Paul also talks about that Satan may aim at us. And then there's this idea of the concepts of duty, honor, and service. There's that, what's the esprit de corps, there's the feeling of our ultimate goal. Well, we have an ultimate goal. It certainly is God first, others second, and then me, self, as hopefully almost an afterthought. And that's what we want to keep in mind. The army breaks down, an army breaks down the moment people start thinking about themselves. What somebody said once, a rational army would turn and run away. Because the people are going to be dying in a battle. And so if you're thinking rationally, about yourself, the first one to run away may be the one who lives. And so it breaks down the moment people start thinking about self. And so that's why you have all that focus on uniformity. That's why you have the focus on team, because success will come only if we focus on team, the group, the family. And so I think that applies to us as well. Success is very, very difficult. Very, very difficult in this spiritual warfare if we are thinking about ourselves and looking out for ourselves. And then there's this military bearing, right? You know, you have that look, that feel. The joking part of that's when you see the person over in England with the great big black hat, right? And they're standing there and they won't move no matter what. And people will go up and get a picture of them. If you are familiar with Mr. Bean, comedian, love that guy, Rowan Atkinson. There's a short video clip where he's trying to get a picture of one of these guys, and he ends up, putting plants and flowers in his hair and on him and stuff, trying to dress him up, and the guy eventually starts looking around like, what are you doing? But military bearing. Well, what's my military bearing? I think it's to, be serious, to be sober-minded. All the qualities that I'm supposed to have and develop as I mature as a follower of Jesus, as a Christian, that will improve the success of the team, because the more all of us are loving and kind and patient and the different qualities we're supposed to have, the more all of us have matured, the better we're going to function together. As I say, it's the same for the Lord's army. The song we used to sing with the kids was always about in VBS to get them, I may not fly over the enemy and all that kind of stuff. It focused on the physical aspect of warfare. I wish there had been a song for kids in VBS about the Lord's army that would have talked about the qualities that we need to develop, because maybe more of us would remember those if we had had a song we learned as kids. I can still, that song will be floating in my head all day, having mentioned it, but I wish there had been a version that maybe you'll be thinking about being gentle and stuff like that floating through my head. Sometimes it's pretty easy to identify enemies. You think about World War II movies, right? The soldiers all wore uniforms that were different. The Nazis had their uniforms that you could tell who they were. They were walking across the field or walking into town, and the Allies had their uniforms. So sometimes it's easy to tell, but the last thing an enemy wants to do is to be seen easily. Usually you're not going to drive out into the middle of a field and set up your artillery, with just grass everywhere for a couple of miles all around. You're going to put that piece of artillery, in the trees or behind some trees or just over the hill. You're going to put some netting over it. You don't want to be seen easily. Well, that's why enemies will often use camouflage. Remember in the past, during the Revolutionary War, what were the British called? The Redcoats. The Redcoats. Do you think that made them pretty easy to see as they were marching across the field? Or if they were coming into town? They were redcoats. Red is the color that draws the most attention. That's why, hopefully, it's put on stop signs and stop lights, right? You notice red very, very quickly. Well, usually armies today don't wear redcoats. In fact, the uniforms that they wear are all designed to be camouflage. And it used to be, camouflage has developed over time and modified over time. In fact, now they use computer-generated camouflage uniforms that supposedly blend in, and they'll change the uniforms depending on whether the force is being deployed into a desert area or into perhaps a jungle area or some other type of environment, because they want to blend in. They don't want to be noticed. No force wants to be advertising its presence. Well, in terms of our enemy from a spiritual standpoint, look at Matthew 7:15. Jesus speaking here says, "Be careful of false prophets. They come to you and look gentle like sheep, but they are really dangerous like wolves." If a wolf walks in here in a few minutes, hopefully all of you will get out, but I have a strong suspicion you'll be chasing me, as I will already be out the door. Now, that will be a failure of mine because of thinking of self. I'm fully aware of that. But none of us are going to just go up and say, well, welcome here, Mr. Wolf. Thank you so much. Are you hungry? And then reach out a hand to them. Because you'll know it's a wolf and you will stay away from the wolf. You will not associate with the wolf. You will not, treat it as a friend. Well, same thing with false teachers. The last thing a false teacher wants to do is say, walk in first time here at Center Chapel, well, maybe this will be the 10th church I have destroyed. Right? I mean, how foolish would that be as a marketing campaign for someone who is a false prophet? The false prophets, Jesus says, look gentle like sheep, but inside they're really dangerous. That's certainly true for people that have bad motives, who are looking to take money from the flock, and a lot of false teachers are very oriented toward money and cash. Scammers, the scammers don't call up and say, I'm a scammer, you got any money for me today? No, they want to call up and impersonate your doctor or a hospital or a sheriff's office or whatever it may be, because they're trying to show themselves to you as someone that is trustworthy or an associate. So, from our standpoint, the enemy, the spiritual enemy, likes to hide. And I think that's part of why the cultural image that I strongly suspect the devil's had a lot to do with, of the devil, is what? What color is the usual picture of the devil? Red. So if you think about the redcoats, if you think about the picture, the caricature of the devil, he's red. And if you see something bright red coming in with horns and a pointed tail, you're going to be going, I think I'm getting out of here. Because you can pretty much tell this is not going to go well, right? This is not going to go well. So the devil doesn't come into our lives that way, doesn't come into our churches that way. The devil comes in as a soft, easy voice. The devil comes in as someone that perhaps you want to be around, someone who tells you things you might want to hear. And so the enemy uses camouflage. Now, there's another aspect to this, very much another aspect to this, and that's when you think about the physical armies today, right? They're using camouflage in order to hide from the enemy, I mean, the Marines, the Army, and all these others. Unfortunately, in terms of our spiritual warfare and being a spiritual warrior, some people who ought to be fighting use camouflage to make it seem like they're not part of the army at all. The devil typically is not chasing after, in the spiritual warfare, somebody who is just completely living in sin, because he figures, I've already got him. And so if you're thinking of someone who is involved in immorality or gambling or drinking or just sin, fill in the blank with potentially 1,000 possibilities, the devil's thinking, they're on my side anyway. But if you think about it from a Christian standpoint, too many Christians, I think, like to appear when they're not in church services as if they just blend in with the rest of the world. Some people want to blend in with the world so that the world won't, pick on us, won't attack us. We'll talk about Jesus when we're together, but then never talk about Jesus when we're away. And if you were to look on a Thursday morning at 10 o'clock, have 100 people and watch them for an hour, you might not be able to tell who's actually a spiritual warrior on God's side and who's not. And so camouflage can be something we essentially kind of want to do, because if I'm standing up for Jesus, maybe I'm afraid that the devil will come after me. And maybe that's not something I want to have happen, and so I will try to blend in with the world, and that's a very bad thing. Look at Ephesians 6, 10 through 11. Paul says, finally, be strengthened by the Lord and by his vast strength. Who's more powerful than God? Who is more powerful than God? With a word, he called the universe into existence. Is there anything God can't do? I mean, we sing that song. No. And so how can we ever doubt or think that the battle's not going to end with the way God has said it's going to? We should be strengthened from the vast, tremendous strength that God himself has. And the way that we are strengthened, as we said before, is to put on the full armor of God so that you can stand against the schemes of the devil. Sometimes the devil comes after us perhaps directly fighting, but sometimes it's a scheme, it's a plot, it's some sort of tactic, right? Some sort of tactic. I mean, when you think about it, and we'll be talking about how he appealed to Adam and Eve in the garden, and we always talk about Eve. Eve's the one that did it first, but from all appearances, if you read it slowly and closely, it looks like Adam was standing right at her elbow. And when she took a bite, she gave it to Adam, and Adam just took a bite. There's no mention in Scripture that Adam was deceived. There is a statement that Eve was deceived. And so sometimes preachers will point out, very improperly, that, well, the woman was deceived. Well, what does that tell you about the man? Think about that for a minute. It says Adam ate of the fruit knowing what he was doing. Think about it for a little moment. Which is worse? Eve got fooled and sinned. Adam, oh sure. No hesitation. No hesitation. So there's no mention, right? If you're looking at that, I tend to think somebody that gets deceived is a little lower down on the thing of rebellion than somebody that just does it knowing what they're about to do. So give me a break on that. But we need to stand against the schemes of the devil. It's often tough. We need to be prepared so that we can stand. Think about it, right? The armies of the world go through training. We need to realize we need training to develop into the kind of warrior to fight the spiritual battle. That's why the fruit of the Spirit is so important. That's why when Peter talks about add to your faith virtue, there in Peter, all these different qualities that we're supposed to be developing, that's preparing us so that we can stand. That's an aspect of the armor of God. And there can't be any retreat, right? There can't be any retreat. The battle needs to progress and be pressed forward, certainly by us as individuals, every single day. And it needs to be a battle we are getting better at every single day, every single year. When you think about it again this way, so that you can stand against the schemes of the devil, it's often very, very, very tough. I mean, again, remember, a rational army would run away. A rational army would run away. So why do I want to be a target for the devil? And when you think about it, right, think about Noah, the time of Noah. God had had it. He had had enough. He had had enough. I will remove humanity off the face of the earth. Every thought of their hearts are evil. That's it. I created this people. Essentially, I wish I hadn't. I wish I had not. Right? And that is repeated when God is looking at the people of Israel at Sinai. It's almost like, I give these people opportunity after opportunity. I give humanity so many opportunities, and they all seem to do the same thing. Well, that's what we did too, right? We all chose to do what we wanted to do, and every single human that's ever lived other than Jesus himself. So, we're not as smart as we think we are. But when God had had enough, Noah and his family found favor in the sight of God. They were the ones, perhaps, who had earlier in our history put on the armor of God. And it can be really tough to stand. Look at this weather person, right? We see this on the news whenever a storm's coming ashore and stuff like that. The wind's blowing 100 miles an hour, and this very foolish individual standing out there to show us how bad it is. Now, this is actually a joke because this person is standing here, and it came a clip from a video. About 5 seconds after this snap of the video was taken, two individuals go walking by behind him. going to the store or something like that. Sure, it was raining and the wind was blowing, but wasn't nearly as life or death as this individual had tried to make it out to be. But it can be very, very tough. Sometimes it's tough to stand. Sometimes it's tough to hold off the forces that are coming after us. That's why it takes preparation. Luke 6, 46 through 49. Jesus here speaking again says, "Why do you call me Lord, Lord, and don't do the things I say?" You know, you say you're in the army, and you're not following the orders or doing what the sergeant or the lieutenant is saying. If you do that very often in the physical army, you're not going to be in the army much longer. Because to an extent, you're not in the army, right? You're not. And so it's like, hello? What? Why do you call me Lord, Lord, and don't do the things that I say? I will show you what someone is like who comes to me, hears my words, and acts on them. This is the soldier that we would all want to be. We come to Jesus, we hear what Jesus says, and we act on them. He is like a man building a house who dug deep and laid the foundation on the rock. When the floods came, the river crashed against that house and couldn't shake it because it was well built. We are that house to an extent, right? We are that person who built the house. We're in the house. The flood is coming. Notice it doesn't say if the flood came, the river would crash against it and the house would stand. Jesus says when the flood came. The flood's coming. I don't know when the flood will hit each of us. Perhaps it already has. I don't know how the flood's going to hit, what angle it will come, but a flood is coming. We need to have built our house, our spiritual house, our armor, preparing ourselves by digging deep and laying the foundation on the rock. Who's usually put forward as the rock? Jesus, I would think. God is the rock. God is our refuge in a time of trouble. And so that foundation needs to be upon the words of Jesus. Remember, this is someone who came to Jesus, heard his words, and acted on them. So I would say the word of God, the word of Jesus, is that rock that the foundation needs to be built on. If we do that, when the floods come, there won't be any shaking that occurs. When the battle comes from the devil, when the devil's trying to come after us, he may think, as the Bible also says, I'll essentially go after the weaker person. The lion circling the group of animals typically goes after the younger or the weaker. Why battle against the big bull in the herd? Let's go after something that's a lot easier. So the more prepared we are, perhaps the less likely the devil will truly come after us. That doesn't mean he doesn't come after us, because there'll be a big celebration, as it were, if the devil can take down the bull of the herd, because that can be very disheartening to the other members of the flock. So we always got to worry about that. But, as a contrast, right, the one who hears and does not act, the one who came to Jesus, you had to come to Jesus to hear what Jesus said. The one who came to Jesus, heard, and does not act is like a man who built a house on the ground without a foundation. If we wanted to build a house right over here, Larry, do you think it would work well if we just started putting the 2x6s and the 2x4s with no, foundation underneath it? It'd be like one of those bouncy houses when the wind came. I mean, it was whoa, it would be gone. And so in this case, you built the house on the ground without a foundation. The river crashed against it, and immediately it collapsed. And the destruction of that house was great. We don't really get, perhaps, living in Middle Tennessee, the picture that's really what Jesus is talking about over in the land of Israel. It's much more common to see this kind of stuff out west, out in perhaps Arizona or New Mexico. You'll have a basin that in the time of the monsoon or the time of the big rains when they come, it's dry most of the year, and you can put a house right next to it. And the big rains come and all that water runs off. There's not grass to soak it up. It runs off of everything. All of a sudden, whoosh, in almost no time at all, you got a huge flood coming. Now, depending on the amount of water, even a house with a great foundation can get washed away in one of those. But certainly, Think of a tent. I like to think of the house Jesus is talking about here. Somebody just pitches a tent. Maybe they've got a couple of those little metal prongs they've tapped into the ground to hold the tent down. That's not going to work when the river crashes through it. And we saw some of that with that terrible tragedy at the Bible camp. Remember that? What was it, a year and a half ago? Where all those young people were there and the water just kept rising and rising and all those young people perished. Well, that's what Jesus is talking about here. They thought they were prepared and they didn't have their plans laid out as best. The people running it didn't seem to, and so terrible tragedy happened. Jesus is saying, don't let this kind of tragedy happen to us. Don't let it happen to us. A warrior also recruits others. There's recruitment offices. Okay, you can drive past them. I don't know where one is. Is there one in Mount Juliet? Anybody know? Where is one in Mount Juliet?
It's
north of the interstate by Lowe's. Which service is it, if you remember? The Army. Recruitment offices, right? They let people in the community know that there is an army. They let people in the neighborhood, the community, know that if you want to become part of us, if you want to join up, here's where you come and find out more, right? Well, that's what Center Chapel is. I don't want to be too cavalier and too common with it, but this is essentially a recruitment office for the Lord's army. We are here to show the community that the army is here, that you can find a place to belong, and that you can make a difference in the world and a difference in your life. A lot of the things that might recruit somebody to join the armed services could apply to somebody becoming a member of, as we've been talking about, the Lord's army. There's also the situation of recruiting people by actually talking to people about it, right? You live as the soldier. It's very impressive when you see somebody, if you're traveling in an airport, who's in a uniform. For years, I've always embarrassed them by actually thanking them for their service. Many times they don't seem to want anybody to talk to them, but I don't want them to get away without thanking them for doing what they're doing. So we can live as a soldier. If we're living as a soldier, people ought to be able to tell. If I have passed by members of the armed services in airports and they're not in their uniform, I don't notice. I don't notice. And so if we are going around in the world and people can't tell that I'm a member of the Lord's army, granted, I'm not sure. If I go to Costco, which is where I think we're going after church service, I walk in like that. Do you think people are going to think I either go to church or I'm a preacher? Of course they will, because very few other people are going to be in there in a suit and tie. That's not what I'm talking about. But during the week, people should be able to tell that we're members of the Lord's army, that we are a spiritual warrior, right? And if not, that's bad, right? We need to live as a soldier. We need to show Jesus in our lives. We also need to directly tell people about Jesus. And that's where, in our culture today, we have that great reluctance. I feel it. I know you do. And so that's why the smallest little steps of getting in a habit of talking about things can be a good first step. Remember what I have recommended? What have I recommended you try to do that's, I think, really easy? It involves a checkout line at the grocery store, right? At the very least, how's your day going? Somebody says to you. Say, it's going great. God sure has made a great day today. If we can't do that, then we got a long way to go. We got a long way to go. In our society, that's perfectly acceptable. Nobody's going to, throw down the checkout counter and come across and start trying to beat you on the head because you mentioned that it's a great, beautiful day God has made. That's perfectly acceptable, and it's a good habit to get into. Or if you're eating out and the server comes, you can say, have a blessed day. I hope God blesses you today. Nobody's going to get upset at that either. I hope God blesses you today. Well, at Creve Hall recently, I heard about this, I think 2 weeks ago. An individual got into a woman who got there to the airport, got an Uber, got in Sunday morning early, got an Uber driver and brought that person to the Creve Hall building so she could be there at church. On the way, the young woman talked to the Uber driver about God. Well, you going to a church? What's the deal? So they started talking, and she encouraged the driver after talking. It's a 20-minute drive from the airport to the Creve Hall building. Encouraged the driver to come on in. The Uber driver let her out, and the woman came in thinking that was the end of it. The Uber driver instead parked the car and came into the Creve Hall worship service and was baptized that morning. How? Why? Because the person took the time to mention Jesus. Now, does that happen with every Uber driver, every server, every checkout person that you talk to? No, but give the seed the opportunity to grow. And so, some people are really good at it, right? They just throw that seed and it gets all over the yard. Let's at least get in the habit of throwing a single seed. Let's at least throw some seed out. And so it's important. We need to live as the soldier, and we need to directly tell the good news to others. As Jesus said right at the end, Matthew, of his time here with his disciples, Matthew 28:19, "Go therefore and make disciples of all nations." How do you make a disciple? Well, it involves telling people the good news. A disciple is a student, somebody who will follow a teacher around, and you've got to tell them who the teacher is so that they can become a disciple. And so you go and make disciples of all the nations. Tell people as you go. Talk about Jesus. Find people who are suffering or in trouble and be there for them and show how much you care. And that leads to becoming a member of God's family by being baptized. This was one verse that was kind of the final straw down at Lindsley Avenue, which when I mentioned it, led a man to be baptized. This man was incredibly smart. He could quote more verses of the Bible than I can. That's not necessarily saying a lot, but he could. But he had been associating with some of our religious neighbors and had never been immersed. Well, it finally hit him, and what I said was, look, Jesus says maybe 5 or 10 words, perhaps, after this statement. And the last things you tell people are usually the most important. If somebody's on their classic movie, TV scene of a deathbed, right, they're not going to tell you that, "I wish I had planted roses last year." It's usually going to be something that's important to them, that's very, very serious. And so Jesus, before he disappears from sight, tells people to go and teach others. And when they have followed me, when they understand what I came here for, you baptize them. And it said a light bulb went off. You're absolutely correct. There's no reason, if baptism is optional, if baptism really doesn't matter, for one of the last things Jesus says to tell people to be baptized. Hello? And so that's one of the reasons we call attention to it, but you can't get there if we don't tell people directly about the good news. It's great when somebody comes into the recruiting office, right? And some people do that. Some people become a member of the Army or the Navy or the Marines or whatever because they decide and they drive up and they walk into the recruiting office. Others come into the recruiting office because they've got a friend or a family member who's part of the armed services. And in talking about it, perhaps they even show up with them and walk into the recruiting office with that person to join up. And sometimes it can simply be having seen people who are in uniform, seeing people who are in the armed services that convinces someone that's who I want to be. Well, again, I'm not trying to be too casual or cavalier about us here as a recruiting office, but those same things apply to us. They do. Also, the warrior does not desert the cause. And I'm always fearful when I put desert up there that I misspell it. Desert, in this case, has one S or two. Anybody know? One. This one has two. I thought that's desert. Dessert has two, but So is that desert or is that deserting the cause? Do I need two S's there? I don't know. English. I'd much rather just have a piece of pie.
The teachers are over there. In this case, it's backwards.
I'm good? You think I'm good? I will never know. I'll never know. There's still words I look at them. I'll stare at the word from, and it'll start looking like that can't be the word from, F-R-O-M. I mean, anyway, the mind is a strange thing. All right, but the warrior does not desert the cause. In the armed services, the physical armed services, if you desert, you are AWOL and they come after you. Well, soldiers who do that can be shot if it's under battle conditions potentially, or they spend some time in Leavenworth or some other prison. Well, look at what happens when people desert the cause of Jesus. 2 Peter 2, verse 20, when they learned about our Lord and Savior Jesus Christ, they escaped from the filthy things of the world. Now, stop right there. Talking about people who hear about Jesus, and I'm going to argue, these are people who became members of God's family. You do not escape from the filthy things of the world, which to me is for getting forgiven of sins. If I understand the filthy things of the world, but I'm still doing them, or if I stop doing them, but I'm not forgiven from them, I'm still filthy in terms of sin. So I believe Peter here is talking about people who heard about Jesus and they escaped. They were forgiven. But if they do that, and then they are again caught up and controlled by those filthy things, now they're in worse shape than they were at the first. Right? That's somebody who joined the Lord's army, who became a member of God's family, and then deserted the cause. Paul expresses great sorrow about that. Demas has forsaken me, having loved the present age. A companion of his, Demas is mentioned elsewhere in the New Testament, a companion of Paul, and yet he deserted. So you got to be real careful. You cannot desert the cause. Ultimately, we need to keep in mind this is a battle, warfare between God and Satan Satan can't possibly win. I don't understand. I mean, talk about a rational army. If Satan were rational, he would have stopped the moment Jesus died on the cross because it's done. It's almost seemingly out of spite. I'm going to take down as many people with me as I can. And that's not rational. It's not rational. When the battle's over, you would try to sue for peace. Well, there ain't going to be any peace, certainly not with some sort of situation here. I mean, God has already won. Jesus won the battle. The outcome is assured with the death, burial, and resurrection. It's done. It's already done. We are involved because we are making sure, as I said, that the devil doesn't take down other people with him. We're trying to spread the good news and bring as many people to a knowledge of the truth as we can. Ephesians 6:14 through 17. With your feet fitted with the readiness that comes from the gospel of peace. We need to be walking, we need to be going around telling other people about Jesus. In addition to all this, take up the shield of faith with which you can extinguish all the flaming arrows of the evil one. Our faith is what can shield us from the attacks the devil is going to send our way. And then take the helmet of salvation and the sword of the Spirit, which is the Word of God. The more we know what God says to us and wants from us, the better prepared we will be. We then have to stand firm. The outcome's assured. We just simply stand and hold the ground that we are placed on. If God is for us, who can be against us? The answer to that is nobody. Nobody. Next week, we will pick up for most of the rest of the class with one specific way that that Satan comes after us. For example, we'll talk about doubt. We'll talk about deception. We'll talk about different ways God tries to get us to desert the cause and take us down in this spiritual warfare. Thank you for being here this morning.